Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate you guys being here. Today we are going to be in John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. So if you want to turn there, go ahead. Also, if you guys want to have your thumbs maybe in Matthew 14, we're going to be kind of going back and forth a little bit just because it's the same story, just two different accounts, so we can kind of get details from both. That would be good. So when I was kind of deciding what section I was going to do, because as we know, the Bible, each chapter is kind of broken up into subsections. On one hand, I thought maybe, we kind of skim this one and take the bulk of the next section, which is, a good topic. But on the other hand, it was, I think this is still a very important passage. And so at the risk of maybe being a little bit of a shorter message, I still think it's something that as believers, we can take a lot away from. So I kind of decided, we'll go with this, only 5 verses, but we'll make sure that we're all able to still take something away from it. So just a quick recap, going through John chapter 4, or just John. We've seen 4 miracles so far from Jesus. We've seen him turn water into wine. We have seen him heal the official's son. We saw him heal the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, and feeding of the 5,000, right? And so this next section, is a little unique in the sense that yes, we will see a sign from Jesus, but unlike the others where there's been a crowd of people who don't know who Jesus is and they see and believe. This is more of a miracle between Jesus and his disciples, right? It's, there's no other witnesses, there's no one else to kind of testify or whatever. It's Jesus and those who already believe in who he says he is, right? So, with that said, I will go ahead and read the passage and we'll pray, all right? So, starting in chapter 6, verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near to the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Let's go ahead and pray. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for this day. I just thank you for bringing everybody here today. Lord, I thank you for this opportunity to just look at your word and grow closer to you. I just pray that you'll open all our hearts to what you have to say, Lord, and that we'll be able to walk away feeling fulfilled in your word. In your name, amen. Mm-hmm. All right, so before we look at this, I have a little story because I actually have a similar experience to these disciples. Several years ago, on our annual family camping trip, you guys might recall, we go to Little Grass Valley every year, and every year, all us children of Brian and Lenny like to take the boat out on the lake just for a little evening cruise, chill or whatever. And so, we were out there. I think David was just dating Samantha. He gave us the good news, like, guys, I got your dad's blessing to date your daughter, or to date your sister, not our daughter. And we're like, oh, cool, that's good. Should we toss him over now? Let him see it? No.
Wow.
No, I'm just kidding. But we were all just enjoying this really good time on the boat. I remember somebody said, I really don't want this time to end. And, we just kept going, having a good time, enjoying each other's company. And, comes time, sun setting, beautiful, but we're getting ready to go back. So I go to turn on the boat. It doesn't start. Okay, mess with some stuff. Go to turn on the boat. Doesn't start. Now, in hindsight, it was just a fuse that needed to be reset, but I didn't know that. And so, I come to them, I'm like, guys, we got a bit of a situation here. The boat's not starting. And we're probably about a mile away from where we need to be. And so, it's like, guys, I don't know. It's getting dark. We're kind of like, well, maybe if we just sit here, somebody will see us and we can call for help. So we wait a little bit, we see some flashlights and we're like, oh, good. My dad, he realized, we're not here. He's worried about us. So we're waving, yelling or whatever, and flashlights go away. Turns out he didn't even realize we were still gone. So cool, So it's dark, and at this point, you can't see where we need to go, but it's light enough out there that, you know, the stars and the moon kind of create like a silhouette of the mountains, and so you can kind of see where the sky and the mountains separate, right? And we know that off to our left there's this bald mountain. It's kind of like a landmark there. We kind of follow the lines down, like, okay, we need to be somewhere in this range. So Evan and myself put on snorkeling fins, and we sit on the back of the boat, and we're just paddling away. Jordan grabs a wakeboard, David grabs something.
Plank of wood.
And they're at the front of the boat, and they're kind of like steering us, making sure we're going in the right direction. And I remember we're paddling, and somebody, or we all kind of were making the joke like, well, I guess God answered our prayer about not letting this time end, you know? But after a couple hours, you know, we finally made it, and all was good. But things that, you know, are different between that story and this story is, one, there was no storm. Like, we were on calm water and we were struggling, right? It was very tough. So, you know, that's kind of my relation to this story. But let's go ahead and look at what these disciples actually went through. And like I said, keep your thumbs in Matthew chapter 14, because John's account of this is a lot less detailed than Matthew and Mark's. And so just so we can have a better understanding, I kind of want to go back and forth between those. Because as we read in John chapter 16, it says, when evening came, the disciples went down to the sea, right? But Matthew 14:22 says, immediately he, being Jesus, made the disciples go to the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds, right? So this is Jesus telling the disciples, hey, you guys go to the boat, you guys head out, and, you know, I'm assuming he told them he'll catch up with them later, right? So they do that. Now, why is that important, right? Well, it's their obedience to Jesus that kind of gets them in this situation where they find themselves in a storm, right? Okay, so we know these four things, right? Jesus tells them to go to the sea. Jesus is not with them. It's now nighttime, and now a storm has arisen, right? And it must have been a pretty decent-sized storm, too, because as we know, you know, the disciples were no strangers to being out on the water. At least 3 or 4 of them were trades fishermen, right? They'd been out on the water. They'd fished on this body of water many times, oftentimes through the night as we read through the Bible. So for them to, you know, have this much of a struggle in the storm, it had to have been, you know, a fairly decent storm, right? And again, let's not forget why they're there. They're there because they're being obedient to Jesus. He told them, you guys go down to the lake, sea. It is a lake, but sea, and you guys sail across, right? And I often think about, you know, as believers, how many times do we, you know, respond to Jesus's calling, and, you know, we end up in a rough situation or something that, you know, is not ideal or out of our comfort zone, something that struggles, right? And I mean, don't you kind of wish the Christian faith was something more like, you know, you give your life to Jesus and then whew, all your problems are gone, right? Wouldn't that be great? Unfortunately, that is not the truth. It is what a lot of people believe of Christianity, but it's just not true, right? What we do know is, you know, believing in Jesus, you get 2 things. You get forgiveness for your sin, and if you live according to how Jesus wants you to live, the world will hate you, because God's word is actually contrary to what the world thinks, right? So, not a walk in the park like a lot of people believe. But getting back to this idea of obedience and disobedience, right? It makes sense that if you're disobedient, you get punished, right? I think about like when I was growing up, I was disobedient to my parents, I got punished. Think about stories in the Bible, you know, Jonah. He was disobedient to God when he told him to go to Nineveh. He ends up in the belly of a whale, right? I mean, that makes sense. I mean, maybe that's a little extreme, but it makes sense. You're disobedient, you get punished. But here we see a story where people who claim to believe in Jesus, who are following him, are being obedient to him, find themselves in the middle of a storm. And I think what's important to know is Jesus knew the storm was coming, right? He's God. He knows everything. He knew that the storm was coming, yet he sends them out there anyways, right? And I think that's a great picture of the Christian life is, you know, you give your life to Jesus, you follow his word, and in following him, You find yourselves in tough situations. You find yourselves in trials and struggles. And it'd be one thing if, this story, they rode and rode and rode and fought and fought and fought and fought, and they ended up where they needed to go. But luckily, that is not the end of it, right? As we see, it continues. Now, again, this is kind of where John's account gets a little less detailed. In Mark chapter 6, you don't have to turn there, it says that Jesus, from the mountain in which he was praying after they sailed off, he sees them, right? He sees them out on the lake. He sees them struggling, right? And getting back to John, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, all right? Now, for those of you who don't know, the Sea of Galilee, or whatever you want to call it, lake, it's kind of like a cone. It goes up, kind of widens here, and then rounds off, right? And it's about 8 to 9 miles wide and about 13 to 14 miles from top to bottom, right? And Capernaum is at about 1 o'clock from the top, right? Slightly east of completely north, right? And we know that they're sailing across, so they're probably somewhere on the west edge, and 3 or 4 miles, regardless of where they're sailing from, puts them somewhere in the middle of the lake, or sea. Sorry, I keep saying lake, but sea, right? So, and I think that's important to remember because, as we'll find later on, but they're 3 or 4 miles out, somewhere in the middle of the sea, and they've been rowing for hours, right? It doesn't say that, but in Matthew chapter 14, verses 25, it says, and in the 4th watch, when the night came, he was walking on the sea. Now, for those of you who don't know, 4th watch is a Roman way, or watch is kind of how Romans kept time. 4th watch is somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., right? And so we know they took off evening, right? It was, probably sun setting, whatever. So they've been battling this storm all night long. And for experienced fishermen to be on the water for, 7 or 8, 9 hours and only get it 3 or 4 miles, again, it just shows how strong that storm was, right? But again, so 3 or 4 miles out, battling it for hours, and now they see Jesus walking to them, right? He's walking on the water, he's walking to them, and they see him and they get scared. Why are they scared? Well, again, John doesn't really record this, but in Matthew we know they think he's a ghost, right? And we know that this is not their first time that they've been in a storm with Jesus, right? In Mark chapter 4, there's a story where they're in a storm. Jesus is sleeping on the front of the boat, and they wake him up and go, Jesus, don't you care that we're about to die? And he says, do not be afraid. And he calms the wind and the waves, and then they say, who is this man that he can control the wind and the waves, right? So this isn't the first time that they've been in a storm, but again, they see Jesus, they think he's a ghost, right? But what does Jesus say to them? He says, it is I, do not be afraid, right? And this is the part in Matthew where Peter says, Lord, if that is you, command me to come to you and I will. And so Jesus says, come. And Peter gets out on the water, takes a couple steps, sees a wave, gets scared, sinks. Jesus picks him back up, gets into the boat, right? And I think this is really where the heart of this message is getting to is, yes, our obedience to Jesus is going to lead us into trial. It's going to lead us into temptation. It's going to lead us, not into temptation, out of temptation, but it'll lead us into uncomfortable situations, right? But no matter what the situation is, no matter what the storm is, Jesus is there. He will come to your rescue, right? Now, on the flip side of that, we do have to let him in, right? We see in verse 21, says, then they were glad to let him in the boat. And some translations will say, they willingly took him into the boat. And what happens when they did that? Well, in Matthew, it says the wind and the waves stopped. And in John, it says they immediately arrived at their destination, right? And again, strong waves, or strong storm that he stopped. They're about 3 or 4 miles in the heart of the lake, which puts them probably 3 or 4 miles away from the nearest shore, right? It wasn't like they were up on the coast. Jesus just came from this angle and was like, hey, I'm here. Look, land's over there. No, Like he got in the boat and immediately, boom, they were where they were at, or where they needed to go, right? And I read this, and it shows, one, God's power, right? He has the ability to control the elements, as we've seen before. He can essentially teleport you where you need to go, but it also shows his love, right? But when I read this, I can't help but ask, if Jesus knew there was a storm coming, why did he send the disciples to go, right? Why did he send them into a situation he knew was going to challenge them? Or, when he saw them from the mountain, when he's up there praying and he sees them, why didn't he just, hey, storm, calm down, let them, get there on their own? Right? Why did he do this to them? Why did he challenge them in this way? And I think there's many answers out there. All are true, not all, a lot are true, but I think one big one is just when he shows our inadequacies, he shows how much we need him, right? And he shows how powerful he is, right? And yes, it is a two-way street. He is all powerful and can help us through anything, but we have to be willing to take that help and reach out for the help, right? And I think in reviewing this passage, again, the difference between the others of having a crowd who doesn't know Jesus versus this being, directly to people who claim to follow him or are following him, it shows that even after we accept Jesus into our life, it's not over there, right? It's not like, okay, I'm a Christian now, I'm good with you, God, I'll live my life. No, we're going to have struggles, and it's a two-way street, right? God is always willing to come to our rescue, but we've got to be consistently pursuing him, right? It's a two-way street. Another thing I think is pretty cool in this passage is, the wind and the waves are obviously very powerful things, that so much so that it's preventing experienced fishermen from, getting to where they need to go. But what does Jesus do? He walks on top of it. He walks on the water, completely unaffected by the wind and the waves, right? And it just goes to show that things that cause us struggles, things that, prevent us from moving forward, don't affect him. He is completely above any and everything that causes us any kind of struggle or trial. And I think that's amazing. 2020 has been a year to say the least, right? We're probably going into another lockdown. You've had all this other stuff, so much uncertainty with politics, and that's not even to include what's going on in your day-to-day life, right? And I don't know where everybody is at in your life. I don't know what storms you might be going through, but Jesus is there. He's there, and he's saying, do not fear, right? Do not be afraid. It is I, right? And I think that's something we should be encouraged by, right? We have a God who is always there for us. And again, following Jesus is not easy, right? It's not a fairy tale walk, but there is hope. And in closing, I just want to read a couple verses from Isaiah and Joshua, just as encouragement, right? So if you guys want to turn to Isaiah chapter 41, and then also maybe thumb Joshua chapter 1. I'll give you guys a minute to turn there. Isaiah 41 and Joshua chapter 1. All right, so Isaiah 41 verses 10 says, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." All right, and then turning over to Joshua chapter 1, it says, "No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. I mean, that's awesome. Whatever storms, figuratively, realistically in life, God is there. He will strengthen you. He will help you. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you, and he will be with you wherever you go. How encouraging is that, right? Like, life on this world is, there's some great things, but it's a mess, right? At the end of the day, it's a mess. It's a sinful world. There's a lot of joy that God has given us through this, but regardless of what situation, what season we are in, God is with us. He will never leave us. He will never forsake us, and he will give us the strength we need to pursue through any of our trials. Amen. So with that, I hope you guys are encouraged. I will go ahead and pray. We will take communion, and then David is going to close us out at the end of that. So let's go ahead and just bow our heads. Thank you, Lord Jesus, again, for the opportunity here to just grow closer.